It's a pleasure today to introduce someone who has supported the CFFC for more than a decade and helped this community grow in steady, thoughtful ways. Dr. Ryan T. Cragun is a husband, a father, empirical sociologist in that order. His research focuses on nonreligion, Lifestances, and Mormonism, and he has published in leading journals, including the Journal for Scientific Study of Religion and Sociology of Religion. He's the author and editor of numerous books, including Goodbye Religion and Beyond Doubt, and teaches at the University of Tampa. Today, he'll introduce the concept of Lifestance from his 2025 book and explore how it reshapes the study of what's often described as other to religion. So please join me in welcoming back to the CFFC, Ryan Cragun.
Thank you. Thanks, Jess. Want to still that too? Got it. There we go. All right. Thank you. It's a delight to be back. I am talking about a new book. The book came out November, I want to say, 2025. The nice thing is this is not a book sales event. The book is free. Okay, so we made it open access. The book is completely free. There will be a QR code at the very end where you can download the entire book. So we made it free because we just want people to be able to access it. Before I get too deep into the book, though, we're going to take a little bit of a tangent and explain why the book. So that's the first part, is we're just kind of explaining why we did this, and hopefully it makes sense. And I'm going to start with what seems like an unrelated, but it is actually a related question. So I'm going to put a picture up. Any pilots in here? We have one. Okay, my apologies in advance. Who are my non-pilots? Okay, so there's a reason I'm asking this, right? How many of you, when you introduce yourselves as non-pilots? Right? And part of the reason why I ask this, right? I do have a brother-in-law who's a pilot. He flies for Delta. If you've talked to a pilot, they tend to like to tell you that they're a pilot. They like talking to, sorry, this is why I'm apologizing in advance, right? Pilots like to tell you that they're pilots and they like to talk about being a pilot. But most of us, being a pilot is not a part of who we are, right? We're non-pilots. We don't walk around telling people, hi, my name's Ryan, I'm a non-pilot, right? Like, we don't do that. That's just not how we function in life. But this is kind of where we're going with this idea of life stances, is a lot of what happens with the non-religious is we focus on what we're not. Does that make sense? So this is where we're headed. That's why I start with this. And I wrote an entire paper where I use this as the example. I did hat tip to my brother-in-law, right? So I'm not trying to be mean to him. I actually love him. He's a great guy. But boy, does he like to talk about being a pilot. So why start with this, right? Why am I starting with this? If I know that someone is a nun, right? So religion, they're a nun or non-religious, what does that actually tell me about them? The tricky part is all it tells me is what they are not. It doesn't tell me what they are. Does that make sense? So I'm going to put some data. I'm very data-driven. This one is going to be mostly qualitative, right? So those who have been in my presentation before, you know I love numbers. I'm a big stats guy. I had to throw some in. I just had to throw some in. So I'm going to put some up. But I think this is useful. If we look at the roughly 30% of Americans today who say they have no religious affiliation, where do they fall when it comes to belief in a God or higher power, right? So I actually threw it up just so you could see, and hopefully everybody can see this, right? About 19, 20% say they don't believe in a God or a higher power. So this is of people who say, I have no religious affiliation. Only 19% say they don't believe in a God or a higher power. A little higher, 19.8% say they're agnostic. And the definition's actually pretty good. So it's, I don't believe there is a God and I don't believe there's a way to find out. So it's actually pretty good. Then we get our highest category. About 33% say they believe in a higher power of some sort. We don't know exactly what that means. We don't follow up, but we're going to see that we can dig into that. Then we have those who say they believe sometimes or doubt. And among the nones, the non-religious, we still have somewhere around 26% who say, I know there is a God, which is a misnomer, but that's fine. They're saying that, right? So by knowing that somebody is not religious, does that tell me what they actually believe when it comes to a God or a higher power? Do you see what I'm getting at? So all we know when somebody says they're not religious is what they're not. We don't know what they are. That's the kind of impetus for this entire project, which is actually kind of weird. So I spent a lot of time on this. None is an absence category. That's what we're calling it, okay? So it's telling us what you're not. It's an absence category. What we're really interested in is the substance behind the absence. What do non-religious people actually believe? And that's what inspired this entire project. So this project actually comes out of a 7-year grant funded by the Canadian government, because they care about stuff like this, which is pretty interesting. But we tackled this idea of like, can we understand what non-religion really is? What is underlying the absence there? What is the substance behind this? So hopefully that begins to kind of give you a sense of where we're going with this. So I'm going to take a very quick detour to illustrate more of why I'm doing this, right? So again, a bit of a detour. There are a number of people, I don't know if this is you, right? But if you put a bunch of atheists, humanists in a church, right, you might look a little dour like this, who instead of saying, okay, what do they actually believe? They try and force these individuals into the category of being religious, okay? And I'm going to give you some examples. Like I said, this is a bit of a detour, but again, this comes out in the book as we wrestle with this, because they want to broaden the idea of religion so broad that all of you would be considered religious. Okay, and I'm going to explain this, and I'm going to show you some very specific examples to kind of illustrate what's going on, right? Some people have tried to solve the idea of the absence category by broadening this idea to make everybody religious and or spiritual, which is kind of a weird way to go about it, but that's what they're doing, right? So what they've done, they've called this lived religion, and the original idea behind lived religion is actually not bad, right? So I want to be very, very kind of generous to the idea, but it's gotten out of hand, right? So the original idea is that people take their traditional religion, they've got a religious affiliation, but they customize it. They customize it and they live their religion however they want to live their religion. Good examples of this, right? Official position of the Catholic Church on birth control. Does anybody know? What is it? Not allowed. Not allowed. No forms of artificial birth control. The rhythm method, but that is not an artificial form of birth control, right? So we have, it's not allowed. Yeah. Not allowed. What percentage of Catholics use birth control? About 70%. About 70% use birth control, right? So they're customizing their religion, they're living their religion. If you want to do something like this, put, a Virgin Mary in your front yard, that is a form of lived religion. You're living religion how you want to do it. This initial version of this, which came out in the 1990s, perfectly acceptable, and I think actually reflects what most people do with religion. They take the religion, they take the orthodox views, beliefs, values, etc., and they customize them, and then they live it how they want to. Totally fine. I actually have no qualms with this, right? If that's what you want to do, great, we can study lived religion. But it's been broadened out, right, in a very weird way. So some people have taken this idea of lived religion and broadened it so far, I'm going to have a lot of quotes today, and I'm just going to kind of highlight some of these. They've broadened it so far that now it's taken over everything. So this actually comes from a book by a scholar at Boston University, Nancy Ammerman, and she's talking about what can be included under the rubric of lived religion today, okay? So I'm going to hit kind of these parts that are in bold. Equally religious practices are named as such because of where and how they happen, even when the actors, you, are not personally and directly aware of a sacred presence. A practice can be religious because of how it is socially framed. Okay? And I'm going to give you some very specific examples that she actually describes, and conveniently, like you set this up. You just went on a nature walk. Religion? According to Nancy Ammerman, absolutely, you all just engaged in a religious practice. Right? So this is where we're going, and this is why we're taking issue with what's happening. So I'm basically like giving you some insider baseball on what's happening in the sociology of religion today. It's a little bit weird. The quote continues, right? I'm going to skip over a lot of this, but she includes all of spirituality into this. No questions? Okay, we're going to hold on questions. Okay, we're going to hold on questions. I will actually have a couple of times where I want you to be thinking about questions for the Q&A. So we will definitely have a good, strong Q&A. Quote continues. I'm going to skip over this. I want to get to this last part. That last bolded line was like the kicker for me when I read this book. So this is Nancy Ammerman talking about lived religion, and she says, I think I have a laser pointer, whether or not they are labeled religious by the actors. So even if you said, we just went on a nature walk, and for us, this was just something that we were doing, we had a good time, you're a bunch of secular atheists going on a nature walk. She can label that a spiritual exercise and study it as a form of lived religion. they're taking the idea of lived religion and they're pushing it on everybody and saying, well, if you're doing these things, that's actually just religion. Y'all are religious now. Congratulations, you're religious, right? It's a very interesting way that they're pushing this idea, and in part, we're pushing back with Lifestances. I'll come back to Lifestances, right? Other examples to illustrate this. So the implication is that if you do or believe something that someone thinks could be religious or spiritual, like yoga or nature walks, right? Then guess what? You're religious or spiritual. They have broadened the idea so far that it makes literally everybody religious or spiritual. Now, here's why they're doing this. If everybody is religious or spiritual, is religiosity declining? It can never decline. It can't go away. So this idea of secularization, that religiosity is declining over time, it can't happen because guess what? You're all religious all the time. Does that make sense? It's a very weird approach for many of us, but this is partly what we're responding to, okay? Now, it's not just Nancy Ammerman. That's like just one person, right? There are actually many, many scholars who are doing this, but you've also seen it in other places and you probably didn't realize it, right? So this is all just lived religion. Another example of this, right? And I do want you, again, don't answer this now. I want this in the Q&A. Does that make sense to you? Do you buy it, right? Are you convinced that this is actually a good approach for understanding what's going on in our lives? I already see you answering the question, right? Do you consider yourself religious or spiritual in this sense? I want to wrestle with that in the Q&A, right? So I genuinely want to get your feedback because this is part of what we're wrestling with, right? All right, next. They're not the only ones, right? I actually created some diagrams. I'm going to skip over these relatively quickly, but I'm going to come back to them when we talk about Lifestances. What Nancy Ammerman actually did with the original version of lived religion, it looks something like this, right? So let me again get my laser pointer. We have spirituality down here. We have religiosity up here, and you could kind of divide it into like what people do and then orthodox religion. So it's kind of a division, right? These do overlap, so people can be both religious and spiritual. We're not saying that that can't. Nancy Ammerman basically said, nope, all of this is just lived religion. All of spirituality and all of traditional religion is actually just lived religion. She has broadened it to where it encompasses everything, including everything that you do, okay? It's a very weird approach. We're pushing back against it for a variety of reasons. Now, whether you agree or not, right, obviously some prominent researchers have done this, so has Pew, okay? And you'll see my asterisk up there. I actually really like the people at Pew. I've consulted with them. In fact, I consulted on both of the studies that I'm about to show you. I'm going to shit talk Pew for just a second, right? And I apologize to the people at Pew, but they know I disagree with them on what they've done in these next three slides, right? So they're doing kind of the same thing, right? I was asked to consult with them on two studies. One was about spirituality in the US and the other was on non-religious Americans. And you're going to see what they did here, and it's really sneaky, right? And I don't think they're trying to be malicious about this, but what they're doing is kind of, I don't like it. It makes me feel a little icky, right? So I want you to take a look at this. This is in their study about spirituality in the United States. Spirituality. And they're claiming that all of these things are spiritual practices. So just to give me a sense, right? By a show of hands, how many of you have ever spent time looking inward or centering yourselves? You're spiritual, okay? How many of you have spent time in nature? You're spiritual, right? Meditate, who are my meditators? You're spiritual, right? Exercise, does anybody do that? It turns out that's spiritual too, holy crap, right? Practice yoga, you're spiritual. Does that make sense, right? But this is, you've heard of Pew, right? They are a major research outfit based out of DC. They release studies all the time. They're classifying people as spiritual if they do any of those practices. Does that make sense? It's weird. There's something going on here, right? So I just want to make sure, like I'm not just making this up. This is what people are doing. Here's another one. This is for a study on the non-religious. Both of these studies came out, one was in 2023, one was in 2024, right? So this one, most nuns believe humans have a soul or spirit. They added spirit. It wasn't in the original question. A soul or spirit in addition to a physical body. If you look, this is fascinating. This is all religious nuns. This is super weird, right? So they're now turning you into religious nuns. But atheists, 31% say that humans have a soul or a spirit. 60% of agnostics, 78% of nothing in particular nuns, okay? Which is actually pretty high when you think about it. Like, those numbers are actually really, really high. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. I want you to keep that in mind for the Q&A because I'm going to ask about this again in the Q&A. So they have this at one point in the report, and then they give this different slide a little bit later, and this is the one that like really threw me for a loop, okay? So I'm going to kind of highlight it. Again, most religious nuns, super weird that they're calling them this, right? Nuns believe in God or some higher power. Most don't believe in heaven or hell. So I'm going to highlight a couple of these, right? This is 32% don't believe that people have a soul or spirit as well as a physical body. 67% do. Note the disconnect here, though. What percent believe in heaven? Is anybody seeing that? Like, or am I just the weird one, right? So we have 32% don't believe in a God or higher power, but 61% don't believe in heaven or hell. 67% do believe in a soul of some sort, but they don't believe in heaven. Where does the soul go? What is it, right? Does that make sense? There's a weird disconnect in their data. And they didn't say anything about it. They just assumed like, oh, no, people believe in a soul. That makes you spiritual. You're believing in spiritual religious things. Not connecting that some people might not believe in a supernatural soul. I'm going to come back to that, right? Same with hell. And again, that religious nuns makes very little sense. I saw this report. I'm actually cited in the report, right? So again, I was a consultant on the report, and this report pissed me off so much, I kid you not, that I ended up writing 2 papers to rebut this report, okay? That's how bad, and I don't know if anybody has published peer-reviewed articles. Has anybody like been in the academic game? This takes a long time to write papers, right? I wrote 2 specifically about soul belief. Do I actually care about soul belief? No, I just wanted to illustrate that most of the people who are not religious and say they believe in a soul, think about it in non-supernatural terms. It's your personality. That's all they're saying is like, oh yeah, I think humans have a soul. It's what makes them unique as an individual. I have 2 papers now that show this specifically, okay? So again, we've got people trying to make the non-religious into being spiritual or religious when in fact, they're not. So we're fighting these battles. And I hate to bring you into like inside baseball into sociology of religion, but that's literally what's going on here, right? So when non-religious people say they believe in a soul, they don't typically mean something supernatural. Some do, right? Some absolutely do, but a lot are just talking about personalities. That's it, right? So I had to push back a little bit on this, right? Now this takes us to the book. So we're going to get back to the book. The reason the book exists is because people have been misrepresenting what's going on with the non-religious. We are trying to understand what is the substance behind the absence. That's the whole reason why this book exists, okay? If we assume non-religious people are actually not religious, right, unlike other people, how do we capture the substance of non-religion? That's the purpose of the book. That's what we're trying to do. Turns out we talked to community gardeners, right? And this is super weird, and I'm going to admit this was not my idea. I don't garden, right? I can't keep a plant alive for the life of me, right? Like I have a black thumb. I like to say I have a black thumb. I kill plants, right? I am a terrible gardener. But one of the co-editors, right? So right here at the top, Lori Beeman, she's an amazing gardener, and she was the one who had this idea, and I'm going to explain why we did what we did with community gardeners. The book is not about gardening. So if you're really into gardening and you came here today because you're like, oh, he's going to be talking about gardening, this is not about gardening. I'm sorry. There's nothing really in here about gardening. It's about what gardening can tell us about the substance of non-religion, okay? And it's actually kind of weird. I'll just tell you this in advance. We did not screen our community gardeners for whether or not they were religious. We just went into community gardens and started interviewing people, and it turns out more than 90% of them were not religious, which is super interesting, right? That was not on purpose. We asked about religious affiliation at the very end of the interview. And we kind of cooked the books here in the US. Half of the gardeners, you're going to see how many we interviewed, but half of the gardeners we interviewed here in the US, we interviewed at community gardens that were based at churches. Okay? Quick aside, so this is not anywhere in the notes. I had a student who was helping me with the interviews. She actually was doing one of these interviews in Georgia. She's from Georgia, so it was over the summer. She was in Georgia, went to a community garden that was at a church. She was interviewing a daughter, and her mom happened to be there during the interview. So during the interview, they go through all of this stuff. There are hints throughout the interview. The daughter's actually not Christian, right? But there's just like really subtle hints. Then when my student asks her, "What's your religion?" She goes, "Oh, I'm Christian," right? 5 minutes after the interview ends, my student's in the car on the way out. She gets a text message. She's like, "I'm actually not Christian, but I couldn't tell my mom that. I'm a pagan. Don't tell anybody." Sorry. So we're not naming them. It's all pseudonyms, right? No one's going to get that out. But like, even that person, she's like, "I'm a Christian." No, she's not a Christian. She's pagan, right? It's pretty interesting. So why do we talk to community gardeners? Why community gardeners? It's actually super interesting. We had an idea. I'm claiming a little credit. It was really Lori Beeman, right? She's the PI on the grant. She's in Canada. She's the University of Ottawa. And she was like, "You know what? Guess what community gardeners do? They deal with life and death. When they stick their hands in the soil, what are they dealing with? This is dead plant matter, right? And there are living things in there. So all we really have to do is just like ask them some questions, and it turns out they reveal all sorts of amazing things. And that's what we're going to read today. So you get to read a bunch of these quotes. We're going to end with my favorite one, which is really, really amazing, but that's where we're headed, right? So how do we capture the substance? If I were to ask you, what is your worldview or life stance? We're kind of using those interchangeably. It means something different. Would you know where to start? It's a very broad question, and most people don't even know what a life stance is to begin with, right? But a worldview? Like, do you know what it is? That it comes from a German word, right? And I'm not going to say it. I have a student in one of my classes right now. We were just talking about this, who's from Austria. And I said the word in German, it's Weltanschauung, something like that. And he's like, "That's not anywhere close to how it's said." Like, you're right. I've always gotten it wrong, right? But it comes from the German. We don't use it very often in the US. How do we capture this, right? If I ask you as a gardener to tell me about pests in the garden, turns out people have a lot to say. A lot to say, right? And I never asked them, "Tell me about your worldview." I just said, "Hey, tell me about pests in the garden." We're going to read a quote. So here's the actual question that we asked. What do you do about pests in the garden? Okay, that seems like a pretty straightforward. We have not asked about religion. So religion is like one of the last questions that we ask in the entire interview. So we haven't said anything about religion. And then we ask this: what do you do about pests in the garden? This is one of our US gardeners, and here's her response. Really, really long. Again, I've bolded the highlights, but we'll kind of read through it quickly. So, we're not certified organic, but we try to use mostly organic methods. What has she just told me? She cares about organic, right? Did I ask her whether she's into organic gardening? Nope, didn't say anything about it, but she already told me that this is something she values. We're capturing values by asking about pests in the garden, right? But we still use things like neem oil or so on, so it keeps going. We will pick stuff off plants, right? We'll pick worms off plants, and some people will crush them, but I'm sort of getting to the point where I can't crush them up. What has she just told me? Isn't that fascinating? And I didn't ask her, how do you feel about like killing bugs? I didn't have to ask her. She told me. It's amazing what you get out of these interviews when you just ask the right questions, right? She keeps going, talking about composting, all of these things. And then she mentions kind of as an aside, so she keeps going. She's like, sometimes we'll come to the garden and some of our vegetables will be missing like whole cloth. And we just assume, well, somebody needed it. What has she just told me about economic inequality? She just answered that question. If somebody comes into the garden and steals our carrots, we're assuming they needed it more than we needed it. And I'm okay with that. Fascinating what's going on in these interviews. And again, we didn't ask any of those questions. We just asked about pests. This was about pests, right? We keep going. I think improving the health of the soil, which has been a big global initiative. She cares about the soil. She cares about big global initiatives. She cares about agriculture. And then down here, she says, well, and then sometimes some pests, you can just let them be, right? Isn't that fascinating? Most of us were like, pests, kill them. And what is she saying? No, they have just as much of a right to the food as we do. This is actually their land. Who are the invaders? It's pretty shocking what you can find in just a very simple interview. I was actually super skeptical. Like I said, I'm a quantoid, right? I like numbers. So when Lori's like, we don't know what we're going to get. We're just going to go talk to community gardeners. I was like, this is terrifying. I have no idea. And then we started getting these interviews. And it was really, really remarkable. So what did we learn from this very first one? She uses organic methods. She doesn't like killing pests. She's okay with people taking food from the garden if they need it. She values improving soil. There's a lot out of one question that we asked. And it actually keeps going. I took just an excerpt, right? All of that from one question. What is her life stance? Let's talk about life stance, right? So we're going to get there. This is how many interviews we did. We have we have researchers in 8 different countries around the world. So we did interviews in all of these different countries, right? So we've got lots of different people, over 100 different interviews with community gardeners. Lots of stuff comes out of this. We've written one book and several articles based on it, and we're talking about the one book. So let me talk about life stances, why we're doing this, why we came up. We didn't invent the term. We kind of appropriated the term, if you will, right? The term did actually exist, but we've got a very specific definition. What do we mean when we're talking about life stances? We define this formally as the beliefs, behaviors, and relationships related to one's conception of life and existence, okay? So we're being pretty specific about this. We've got several papers where we go into detail. The book itself, the chapter that I wrote, goes into a lot of detail about what this means, how we interpret this, lots of stuff going on. The point is, everyone has a life stance. This does not single out religious people or non-religious people. So now, if we want to talk about somebody's life stance, does it matter whether they're religious or not? Nope. So we don't have to try and put everybody into the category of religious or spiritual in order to capture their life stance. We can just start asking them really useful questions, right? So remember that diagram? Here's how I started to think about life stances when we were talking about Nancy Ammerman and her idea to like expand lived religion to everybody. Turns out we can just say, you know what? Here's religion over here. It's a tiny part of some people's life stances. Here's the crazy part. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail comparing this. I thought about it. We did have some participants who were religious. Do you think they talked about religion when we were talking about gardening? Almost none of them brought it up. We had like 2 who brought it up unprompted. And at the end, we'd find out, like, no, they're devoutly religious. Most people live their lives without thinking about religion most of the time because they have a life stance. And that life stance is largely secular, if you will. Okay? So that's really what we started to unpack. So basically, most of our lives are over here. Some of that is right here for some people sometimes. Does that make sense? So we're trying to reappropriate who we are as individuals and say, no. Life stances gives us an angle into who people are, okay? All right, so what else did we learn? The book covers connection to other humans, right? Well-being, some really interesting stuff, politics, and a number of sociological debates. I'm not gonna go into most of those. I'm gonna give you one quote, basically, from each chapter very, very quickly, and then we'll turn to Q&A, right? So obviously, chances for you to discuss. I do have one little exercise for you before we get to it, though. So hopefully you all have your smartphones. Don't get them out yet, but I will give you a chance to do that. All right, so quote from chapter 1. I feel like I have a connection. So this is a Canadian gardener. I don't control anything. That is super fascinating when we start to think about who we are in relation to nature. How much control do we really have, right? I try to, in my little garden, I try to put in little rows, or you take something, but the little groundhog comes in and it wants to destroy all that. So it's clear that you're a part of it being nature, but everyone is pretty much equal in that. What has this person told us about their relationship vis-a-vis nature? Are we in a dominant position? They don't see it that way, right? It's a new way of thinking about the world. And I actually don't think it's new. I think we're coming back to old ways of thinking about the world, right? But they're basically saying we're on the same footing as all other living things. Why are we special? That idea of specialness, where does that come from? From Christianity, from religion, from putting humans at the center of everything? Do we really belong there? Our gardeners don't think so, which is pretty interesting. So just a fun quote from the first one, right? The second one is setting some stuff up. This is one of our participants from Finland. People who have never been in contact with nature, I don't know if there are any people, but there are probably some, must be really alienated. And because of that, there are also challenges in protecting nature because people are no longer interested in nature so much. But just the fact that I have now clearly noticed that I want to be closer to nature and want to be good to it. Not that nature would serve me, but that I could serve it. How many of us think about nature that way? A lot of times we think of nature like as natural resources. Those are resources for us to extract. And what is Suvi saying? No. I should be serving nature. It's flipping things around. And again, we didn't ask about worldview in any of these questions. We asked them about gardening, and this is what comes up, right? We get to the Lifestances chapter, so this is the one that I wrote. It was a very long chapter, right? We have Liana again. She's hilarious, right? So Liana's great. But I think it's because it's like a sanctuary. Maybe it's like, I feel like I need to go to church, you put that in air quotes, twice a week, right? I need to be there on Saturdays and Wednesdays, praising the kale and collards. Awesome quote, right? Liana is amazing. She really, really is wonderful. And come to the end of it, right? When we asked her about religion, she's like, well, I grew up Christian. I'm not anymore. I dabbled with Buddhism, but I'm not that either. She's not religious, right? So when she's talking about like going to church twice a week, obviously she's got cultural elements that she's bringing into this. She's lacking good language for other things, but what is she doing, right? She's talking about how she's basically finding meaning and value in what she's doing in the garden. And I love that line, right? Praising the kale and collards, that's awesome. Another really good one, so this one, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on where this comes from, this chains of memory stuff, but one of the things we found is that gardening reconnects people to the past, to the ground, and even to their families, right? So this one, she's talking about it. It reconnects me to my ancestor soil, who are farmers in Canada, right? Even if I live in the city, I have the possibility to have a garden. We've been farmers for generations in Canada. I also think it's in our genes to grow things, to feed ourselves. And I think I'm paying homage to my dad. He loves his garden. Gardening can be a way for us to connect to our ancestors, right? So that's what this chapter talks about. So it's a very long, detailed chapter on like how gardening connects us to other things, which is great. This next one is a wonderful one on politics. So we didn't see so much of the politics in North America, but in South America, we have people in Argentina and Brazil. They talk a lot about how gardening has led them to becoming politically engaged on agrarian reform, right? So that's what this quote is talking about, is like being in the garden, we really need to change things. So they tend to be like anti kind of mega agriculture. I'm not necessarily wading into those debates, right? I'm just saying this is what is coming out of what's going on in the gardens. I love chapter 6. It flips our notion of well-being, right? So this whole chapter is about well-being. So again, a Brazilian gardener. When I came to Sao Paulo, I started to live in an apartment, and the garden was very important to me, sometimes at the end of the workday, where I used the computer to create diagrams. This is probably true for a lot of us. We're staring at a computer all day. I would just look at the garden, feel the sun on my skin, touch the plants a bit. They feel better in gardens. Now, I'm not saying that is the answer to all of the world's problems. This is not a panacea. But what this chapter actually ends up doing is saying, can we actually be healthy if we don't have a healthy ecosphere? It flips that idea around. It's actually quite interesting. This next one's a long quote. I will apologize in advance, but it gets to one of these last kind of big arguments that we're dealing with in Sociology of Religion, right? And it has to do with binaries. So one of the things I've said is like, we're studying the non-religious. We're trying to understand the non-religious. But one thing we realized is most of these people also don't really put themselves into one category or the other. We get somebody like Suvi. So we've seen Suvi before. Suvi from Finland, who says, I don't think I'm religious. I think I'm religious. And you're like, dude, what's going on, right? And if this is something like yes, no, then yes, I do. Well, yes, in the sense that I'm interested in quite a lot of different beliefs, and I'm not religious in the sense that I go to church or follow a particular religion, okay? So Suvi's going back and forth a lot here. I'm not religious in that way, but then again, I'm fascinated by the questions and the interaction between people in many ways, and that's because the stories that are related to religions are quite, in many ways, shared stories, and through them people choose what they do, in what they are, and in what way they are with each other. So then it is interesting to kind of understand this. Keeps going and then says, I've sung in a lot of choirs, and I've also sung in a lot of choir services. So Suvi's not religious, but sings in church choirs, okay? And also very interested in religion. Super weird. And I don't feel that I'm terribly against it, but rather I find it fascinating to see how people are there and in what way they do things, right? I'm also happy to be involved in that activity, but I don't belong to a church. I'm not religious in that way, but then again, in my own way I am. Where do you put Suvi? Can we really put Suvi into a binary? Right? It's a really complicated situation. So we're trying to make this argument of, why do we have to put everybody into like, you're either with us or you're against us, right? Only Sith think in absolutes, right? If anybody gets the Star Wars reference. That's kind of what we're arguing here. Then we get our last fun quote. This quote, I did work into it. This is Liana again. Whenever the co-editors and I, Lori Beeman and Doug Ezzy, whenever we start talking about this quote comes back up, and it's actually beautiful. This was all said in just like one interview. There's minimal editing to this quote, but I had to include it. It's not necessarily just like relevant to anything specific, but it's just beautiful, right? So here's Liana. There's one thing to see it visually. There's another thing to swim in the water of the oceans or when my hands are in the earth. I feel like I'm feeling the heartbeat of the earth. I feel like there's something energetic that flows through me in a different way than just walking on the earth. And I actually can't describe it because I don't know that there's language for it. It's as if I lose the sense that I'm in a separate body, separate from all of this. It's like I'm in the flow of all of this. I'm part of this bigger thing. This is the part we love. I'm the kale. And I'm the worm eating the kale. And I'm the worm that's going to eat me. And so that both energizes me and calms me down. And it just kind of takes away my fear. It just takes away this fear and anxiety. And I just see everything as this bigger stream of living and dying. I think you're just living and dying, coming into being and going away. It's a felt experience, being in the garden. Isn't that beautiful? It's really kind of remarkable. And did we ask her this? No, we just asked her about gardening. Is that a life stance? That's a life stance. It tells us a lot about Liana without us ever having to ask her, what is your worldview or life stance? It's pretty remarkable what came out of this book, right? So again, the book is free. That's a link to the book, okay? So if you grab that one, that is going to take you directly to the publisher's website. We paid in advance to make the book publicly free for everybody, right? So you do not have to pay for the book. I'm not selling books. I can't sign copies. Sorry, right? It's just like, there you go, right? The book's there. It's yours. But I do want to ask you some questions that hopefully we can bring up in the Q&A, right? So just a couple of things. I see everybody's like grabbing this. Good. The QR codes are working, right? Are you okay being labeled religious or spiritual in a lived religion sense, right? So let's talk about that during the Q&A. Do you believe humans have a soul? And again, what do you mean by that? Let's talk about that in the Q&A. If so, do you think of it as supernatural? And then this last one, does life stance make sense? Does that concept work for you? I'm going to end there. You're welcome to grab the book at any point, and I'm happy to take questions. And I think I'm supposed to switch mics at this point.
I don't know if your study shows this or not, but I think in the polls I've seen that the overwhelming number of people in our population are now spiritual versus religious. Is that the way you see it?
So it's a really interesting question. The survey data is tricky on this because it depends on how you ask the questions. Basic numbers, if we ask people what is your religious affiliation, it comes out at about 70% say they have a religious affiliation, about 30% say they don't, okay? So that's kind of our cut for religious affiliation. Now that doesn't actually tell us how many go to religious services. I don't know if I've told you this before, but in my 2024 book, we used a different way at getting at whether people are engaged in religious activities or not. It's called the American Time Use Survey. It's complicated, but it basically asks people, tell me what you did the previous 24 hours. When you look at it that way, does anybody have a sense on a random day in the US, just a random day in the US, what percentage of Americans are doing anything religious? Okay, and that includes praying, going to services, watching it on TV, thinking about it, like anything you want, reading the Bible, anything. I saw a 5%, it's a little higher. It's 12%. So we have 70% of Americans say, I have a religious affiliation. 12% of Americans are doing anything religious on a typical day. That goes up to 18% on Sunday. 18%, okay? And that survey is so detailed, it includes waiting in my car to turn into the parking lot to get into my church. That's how detailed it is, right? So when people say, oh yeah, I'm religiously affiliated, I'm very skeptical. Now, I'm not saying that they're not, right? I'm just saying, what does that actually mean for people? Okay? So that's the religious affiliation one. Often what happens is we don't ask people specifically in the religious affiliation, do you identify as spiritual but not religious? SB&R, right? That's our short version for it. So what we do is we ask a separate question, how spiritual do you consider yourself? And then what ends up happening is you've already restricted how many people can say they're spiritual but not religious, because we have to combine the religion question with the spirituality question, and it's only going to include those 30, I know this is really confusing. It only is going to conclude those 30% who said they're not religious, right? So your spiritual but not religious can never really be more than the 30%. Does that make sense? So it's actually a relatively small percentage of the population would consider themselves spiritual but not religious. As far as how many consider themselves spiritual, it's like 60% say they're pretty spiritual, right? So the numbers are a little tricky, and it's just hard to get at it because of how we ask the questions. Again, like you can read the Pew one, right? So Pew's report on spirituality in the US, they would make all of you out as being spiritual for coming to this meeting today. Because you're thinking about important questions, right? That makes you spiritual. Does that make sense? So I'm very explicit in my classes when I talk to students. We talk a lot about religion. I'll tell them, I don't really like talking about spirituality because I don't know what the hell it means. Define it. Yeah, maybe, right? But it depends on who is actually giving you the definition. The definition of spirituality is so broad, depending on who's giving it, that I don't know what it means, right? Like, tell me what you mean by spirituality, then we can talk about it. So it's a great question. That's the best answer I can give you. It's a little bit tricky. So,
what is religion? Is it like any social activity that you do with metaphysical aims, or like what is it?
Sure, no, it's a great question. The definition that I give my students, right, not all of them love it, and that I use in these books is collective beliefs relative to the supernatural, okay? And I always say that that has two really important components, supernatural and collective. And let me explain just very, very quickly. Supernatural, above or beyond nature, it's things that exist outside of what we can sense, measure, detect, or touch, right? Most people get that. So they're like, ghosts, yeah, okay, gods, sure. So we're talking about supernatural, right? Why collective? This is the example I give my students. Some of them hate it, right? If instead of me showing up today how I did, I had walked through those doors, came up here with long hair, a beard, and a robe, and I told everybody, I'm Jesus, what would you think? That I'm crazy, right? But if I had walked in here with 500 followers and I said I'm Jesus and they all think I'm Jesus, now what do I have? Now I have a religion, right? Difference between crazy and religion is followers. It's followers. That's the only difference, right? Great study came out last year, right? Psychology paper that said psychologists cannot genuinely detect the difference between delusional beliefs and religious beliefs. The only way they know the difference is, are those delusional beliefs socially acceptable? The only way they know the difference is, are those delusional beliefs socially acceptable? That's genuinely the difference between religion and crazy, right? And I'm not trying to demean religion in that sense, right? I'm not trying to say like, oh, religion's bad. It just means religion has to be collective beliefs, right? You can't have a religion of one. So when I'm talking about religion, I'm talking about collective beliefs relative to the supernatural. That's what we mean by religion. So it covers most religions fairly well. There are exceptions. Buddhism, it's a very gray area. What about the Satanic Temple? Bingo, right? So they have a technical classification as a religion. Do they believe in Satan? No, Satan's a symbol, right? So they don't actually have supernatural beliefs, but they got a classification as a religion. Are they a religion? Right? So they're challenging our definition of religion. I make my students read about the Satanic Temple for that very reason, right? They're a super interesting group because then they challenge what we mean by religion. So that would be my working definition. I think that's kind of a standard definition in the sociology.
So I find the terminology around Lifestance really interesting, and I'm interested to hear more about it. And part of what I think is our problem as a collective is that binary thinking, it's a label that people love labels. We love labels. We want to put everything in a box. So that's my question. In your book, or is there follow-up research going on to further define like a spectrum of what life stances are, or a matrix or something like that? Or are we just left with like, well, we have different life stances, so whatever.
Yeah. You're not going to like the answer, but it's the last one, right? So we've been very intentional in saying we don't want to create a typology of life stances, right? We can totally see that somebody will want to do that. So somebody's going to be like, oh, well, there's this type of life stance, there's this type. And our argument is not that that's useful or not useful. It's what space is opened up by introducing the concept of life stance. So we're trying to just push religion out of the center. So we're decentering religion and saying, now everybody's on the same playing field, right? Because right now it's, oh, are you religious or not religious? Oh, you're not religious, we don't care about anything else about you. You're not that. It's an absence category. We're pushing that to the side and saying, no, 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 no. Tell me what you do believe. Tell me what your behaviors are, your relationships, how this brings you into life and the universe, right? That works for everybody. If people want to kind of create typologies in the future, like let them, that's great. We're just trying to create the space so we can do that. So non-religious people aren't continuously marginalized as being absence categories. Does that make sense? So we are rejecting it for now. It's a good question.
2 more questions, but I want to throw this one in a little different than we've talked about. The life cycle of a study like this, barring the book part, which I know complicates the timeline. Tell us a little bit about that. How long do they take? And is there a variety from like an hour, we're going to do it over dinner, to 20 years? You know, give us a quick snapshot of studies like this, publishing papers.
Oof. Okay, so the very quick version, this is a 7-year grant, okay? Year 1 was really kind of planning, but we came up with the idea during year 1. Years 2 and 3 were, one of the co-editors of the book, Doug Ezzy, he actually kept track of how many meetings we had before we started data collection. 48 Zoom meetings, okay? And that's with researchers around the world figuring out what exactly is it we're going to study, what community gardens, how are we going to select the community gardens, what's our questionnaire going to look like. We piloted the questionnaire with a variety of people to make sure it works, right? So it was going back and forth for a very long time. Then we started data collection. First few interviews that come in, we picked them apart to make sure that the interview questionnaire was actually working. So that was another couple of months. Then we're like, all right, this seems to be working, go. 1.5 years of data collection, right? So we're looking at like 3 or 4 years before we have data. And then it's another year of analyzing the data. So the book just came out 4 months ago, right? It was roughly 5 years from conception to publication. So that's not uncommon. Now, those 2 papers that I wrote in response to Pew, those were much faster. I was really pissed off. So those took 6 months, right? From like conception to submission, and then another couple of months for publication. One just came out, I want to say early fall, so last year. The other is technically online before print, so it isn't in a print edition yet, but you can find it on their website. But those, I mean, less than a year, but that's like really unusual for a research study. To go from conception to publication in less than a year is like unheard of. So that's really, really fast. But a book, 5 years isn't uncommon. Most of my books, I would say, take somewhere between 3 and 4 years to write.
I was just having another question about the terminology of life stance, and just wondering, do you feel that it overlaps in any way with this phrase such as one's personal philosophy of life or some terminology like that? Was it related in any way, synonymous? What's the Venn diagram?
So one's personal philosophy of life is a phrase, not a word, right? So it's a little bit more complicated. We actually ended up taking this from the Norwegian, right? So one of our researchers, Inger Furseth, she's in Norway. The Norwegian government has actually been using it for quite a while to talk about all of the perspectives that people have in Norway, right? So no one is being marginalized. Because if you just talk about it as religious versus non-religious, you marginalize one group. So there is that. The other thing that we add, so we could talk about one's personal philosophy, but you'll note that we added relationships and we added behaviors. Okay. Now it's not all relationships, it's not all behaviors. There's a very specific reason. I'm going to use one of Doug's examples, right? So my co-author Doug, he's Australian, lives in Tasmania. One of his children is trans. Okay? When his child told him that they were going to transition, Doug freaked out, right? Doug is a cis hetero male, right? Freaked out, not so much because Doug was anti-trans at the time. Doug was really worried about what was going to happen to their child, right? But the relationship changed Doug's beliefs about trans people. So we're adding a relationship factor because a lot of times our beliefs, our values, our morals are actually derived from our relationships and not the other way around. Does that make sense? So we're complicating the idea of like personal philosophy. Philosophy is all beliefs. We're more than our beliefs. So sometimes our behaviors are reflected, like our behaviors derive from our beliefs, but how often do our beliefs derive from our behaviors? I don't think we like to think about that way, right? We like to think about it as like, no. I believe this, therefore I will do that. Right? Most of us are really good at justifying what we do after the fact, right? So we do things, then we come up with a justification. We have relationships, they change how we think. So we added the idea of like into life stances, behaviors and relationships, because we think all of those are interconnected in really important ways. Does that make sense? So that's really why we developed the concept the way we did. I don't know that we're going to get everybody to buy into life stances, right? Like that's not necessarily the idea. We're, again, trying to create the space so we have something to talk about, like a personal philosophy on life. So really good questions. Yeah.
Yeah, all set. Thanks, Ryan. You're awesome. We appreciate you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Freedom from religion.